Good evening, all. This is Fred Passman. I am the commander of the Continental Commandery of the Naval Order of the United States, and welcome everyone to our. I'll wait until the clock is finished striking the hour of 1900 Eastern Daylight Time.
I wish I knew how to stop it.
That's great.
Excellent. Okay, so I want to welcome everybody to this evening's Naval Order Naval History. This time, rather than a lecture, it's going to be a discussion, but more on that in just a minute. Any guest who may not be members of the Naval Order, just want to tell you that we are our nation's oldest hereditary sea service association. And our primary mission has three components: to preserve maritime history, to promote knowledge of maritime history, and to promote camaraderie amongst those who have served or who have had relatives who have served in the maritime services. And those include the U.S. Merchant Marine, the Public Health Service Corps, the NOAA, U.S. Marine Corps, U.S. Coast Guard, and my favorite, of course, is the United States Navy. The other thing I want to point out to everybody is it's time to mark your calendars for October's National Naval Order of the United States Congress, which will take place 18 to 22 October at the Hilton, Alexandria, Virginia. In addition to the Congress itself, which has an exciting program already well in place, we are planning several side tours that we're still working on finalizing. Watch your emails, watch the Naval Order LinkedIn site and the Commandery's webpage. If you're not a member of the LinkedIn group, invite you to join us so that you can keep a pace and abreast of our activities. With that, I'm going to turn the program over to my companion, John Paracchio, who is the chair of our Naval History Virtual Lecture Series. John, take it away.
Fantastic. Thank you, Captain Passman. So it's my great privilege to introduce Dr. Dennis Okerstrom, who is Professor Emeritus at Park University near Kansas City, Missouri. He retired in 2018 after 35 years of teaching. The Mary Barlow Professor of Language and Literature. He held posts as head of the Liberal Studies Department and chair of the English Department. He's author of 6 books, including Dick Cole's War, which we're actually going to hear about this evening, Doolittle Raider, Hump Pilot, Air Commando. In 2015, his book, Project 9, Birth of the Air Commandos in World War II, won the Best Air Power Book Award from the Air Force Historical Foundation. He received numerous honors from the university for his teaching and writing, including the Distinguished Faculty Scholar Award, as well as being named Distinguished Humanities Faculty. In 2018, he was given the university's first ever Presidential Meritorious Service Medal. Dr. Okerstrom is a pilot and certified flight instructor. He served as a small boat coxswain in the Coast Guard Reserve. He lives with his wife, Jeanette, in Independence, Missouri, and is currently conducting research for a book on glider pilots who transported troops and equipment into Normandy on 6 June 1944, when he is not attending the ball games, soccer matches, and recitals of his 8 grandchildren. So we welcome Professor Okerstrom to this evening's interaction with our audience. And so I must point out that folks who want to ask questions and make comments, use the comments section on the StreamYard website, and I will be relaying those to Denny, is how he likes to be called, as we go forward. As a prelude, we will have a bit of I guess, pictographic history in the form of a movie tone film.
The first time we've taken off of a carrier was when we launched for the mission. You wonder what you're heading into because none of us had been in combat before. We flew the mission at I'd say an average of 250 feet or 300 feet, except the bombing mission.
The planes sweep in without being discovered. They separate into groups to attack the several objectives carefully selected by means of accurate intelligence to ensure that only targets of military value will be hit.
That voiceover, incidentally, was Colonel Dick Cole, who was Jimmy Doolittle's co-pilot in that raid, the first plane off. I got to know Dick over many years, and he has a very distinctive voice. Yeah, that's okay. Thank you. That's he incidentally, it is Lieutenant Colonel Dick Cole at the time, but he was posthumously promoted to colonel about 2 years ago, which was kind of neat. So, yeah.
I mean, how does that happen, Denny?
It happens if everybody in the Air Force knows who you are, and they name bombers after you, they name hangars after you,
air bases.
Yes, and when at your funeral, they send the chief of staff of the Air Force to give the eulogy. So that's how that happens.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So I know we've got a series of questions that we've kind of talked about a little bit, but I thought maybe I could preamble this just a little bit to say, first of all, hello to everybody who might be here, and I appreciate very much this opportunity to talk to you about the Doolittle Raiders. And what Dick always called the Halsey Doolittle Raid. He said, because none of it would have been possible without the Navy. It simply couldn't have happened. And I got to know Dick when I was doing a previous book about the Air Commandos in World War II. A lot of people, when they think about the Doolittle Raiders, they think, one mission, bang, one and done. But that was not the way it was. Almost everyone who was still capable of flying after that mission did so. And many of them were shot down. Many of them were killed. And I think by war's end, 61 were still alive. They were sent, incidentally, to Europe. They didn't want them to continue flying in the Pacific Theater. They did not want them to be captured by the Japanese. They were notoriously infamous to the Japanese. So I know we've got some things that we wanted to chat about.
Yeah, and I think we're going to get into what happened to some of the folks who were captured. So we'll save that.
You bet.
But let's start with this. Shortly after the Pearl Harbor attack, President Roosevelt met with the Joint Chiefs of Staff in order to create or propose a bomb strike of Japan. How challenging was this at the time to execute the mission?
It was pretty challenging. Number one was the sheer distance that you had to fly to get to anywhere in Japan. The Japanese did it by carrier. They sent that whole task force with 6 carriers and 400 planes to just north of Hawaii to get that done. So they had about 200 to possibly 250 miles to fly. We didn't have that option in terms of land bases. And so the biggest obstacle was finding a plane that could fly as far as it needed to. As you can see from this map, and this is an official Army Air Force's map, when the task force, which included the Hornet, as well as the Enterprise, and 14 other vessels, and 2 submarines, they approached, their plan was to get within about 400 miles of Japan. They were spotted. And so I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later, and I'll give you more details about that. But so number one was the sheer distance that they had to somehow shrink that distance if that were possible. The other thing to remember is that there were a lot of people who had a lot of really good ideas, and they always forwarded them to someone that they knew at the Joint Chiefs. One of those ideas involved. There are 900 volcanoes across the Japanese islands. And one of the ideas that somebody put forth was, what if we bombed those volcanoes and caused them to erupt? That would be a quick end to the war. And I think Hap Arnold said, thank you very much, and we're going to take that under consideration, but thanks for letting us know. Okay. Another suggestion was, and this came from a newspaper editor, who suggested that they get 500 airline pilots to fly every airliner available. Didn't say exactly where they'd be taking off from or how they'd accomplish this, but to bomb Japan. And that had a certain amount of enthusiasm, except among the airline pilots, who were not particularly enthusiastic about that idea. Okay. There were some other things though. And we'll talk about exactly how this came about here in just a bit, but there were actually 3 simultaneous missions to bomb Japan that were all super secret. They didn't know about each other. One was led by a colonel named Caleb Haynes in a project called Aquila. And his orders, direct from Hap Arnold, were to take a force of B-17s across the Atlantic, up the African coast, and finally get to India, and then hence into China, where he was going to bomb Japan using those B-17s. It took a while for him to get started because he didn't find out about that until late February, and to form an entire unit like that and get the resources that he needed, he got there after the Doolittle Raid was over. And so Caleb Haynes and all those bombers became part of the 10th Air Force, and also became involved in flying and forming Secret Project Number 7, which was flying the hump. And then the third mission was under a colonel named Harry Halverson, and he took a force of B-24s across, and he was going to follow up after Caleb Haynes. However, he got diverted once he got to North Africa. They had the idea that the Ploiești oil fields in Romania were a source of keeping the machinery of war of the Germans going. If they took that out, that would shorten the war. So they sent him to do that very early. This was in 1942, in August, I believe, of 42. He ended up getting way off target because of some bad weather. And anyway, not much was done, but that was the longest bombing raid of the Army Air Force at the time.
Interestingly, we obviously we have our prepared questions, but we're getting an interesting question from the chat about Adak, Alaska, as a potential option for either a land-based raid or an air-based or Air Force-based raid. Was that considered at all, Alaska?
I think the Japanese were far more worried about that than the Americans were serious about it happening. The Aleutians were probably the closest American land presence to Japan, but it was still a considerable distance. It was probably close to 2,000 miles, say, to Tokyo. And so there was no serious consideration of that by the Americans, but the Japanese weren't certain about that. And that is why they attacked the Aleutians.
at Midway, right, or during the
Well,
Battle of
you
Midway.
know,
Right?
the Aleutians, in Alaska, they actually, had a presence there.
Right,
They
right.
they captured.
Right. What about time of Coral Sea? Was it, or just after Coral Sea? Yeah, something like that.
Probably.
Yeah, yeah. So let's get into this. How did the idea of having bombers take off from an aircraft carrier come about? Where did that
From
come
the
from?
Navy.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
A captain named Francis Lowe
All right.
who was on the staff of Ernest King, the CNO, at the time. And he was flying, he was a submariner, by the way, but he was flying to check on the status of the USS Hornet, which was being built in Norfolk. And he flew over an airfield on which the outline of a carrier deck was painted, and he saw Navy planes taking off and landing from that. And about that time, coming back, then he saw Army planes sort of simulating attacking that as he was headed back, and he thought, So he went to Admiral King and said, "What are the possibilities that an Army bomber could in fact take off from a Navy carrier, which would give us a lot more range?" And King said, "Well, check with Hap Arnold first of all, and if he thinks that's a good idea, then I want you to go see Donald Douglas, I said Douglas, Donald Duncan, who was his air officer and an aviator, and see what he thinks. See if it's feasible, if there's any Army bomber where that might work." So when he approached Duncan said, "Well, I can tell you right now that they might be able to take off, but they're never going to land on a carrier. First of all, they've got a tricycle gear, which means that they had a nose wheel. So the back end sticks way up too high. We can't put a hook on that, to catch the 3-wire. It's not going to happen. Plus, it's just too big and too heavy to consider that. But it could possibly work." So he sat down for about a week and ran through all of the available literature and facts and figures on the various Army Air Force bombers at the time. There weren't that many twin engines. They had the B-18 Bolo, they had the B-23 Dragon, they had the B-25 Mitchell, and the B-26. The first two were really not even considered because they were basically converted airliners, from Douglas, converted, say, from the DC-2. Not a direct correlation, but just kind of a military version of that. The B-25 and the B-26 were the main considerations for this, and after looking at them carefully, he finally decided the B-25 was really the only one that would work because it had the capabilities of, with some modifications, to fly that far. And although the B-26 had shorter wings and had more space to clear the island on the carrier, it also it needed much higher airspeeds because of those shorter wings, and they didn't think that was going to work in the amount of space that they had on a carrier deck. That left the B-25, and so that's how that came about. Just careful consideration of all of that. He wrote a 30-page report, turned it in, and they said, "Yeah, let's take a look at these B-25s."
So, well, you've handled the next question. So then these were not just normal B-25s, right? Because what little I know of the raid, these things were flying gas cans. I mean, they had to be modified. So how were they modified?
They were extensively modified in big ways and small. First of all, range was still a problem. They needed to be able to fly twice as far as what a normal B-25B could fly. Their normal range was about 1,200 miles. They needed it to fly twice that far for the obvious reasons that they knew they couldn't land back on the carrier. Where are they going to go? So they thought they had a deal made for them to fly into China, to land at Chinese airfields and turn those bombers over to Chiang Kai-shek's forces. Unfortunately, nobody thought to tell Chiang Kai-shek that. And he found out about it through the back door just before the raid was to commence. And he was very unhappy and said, "No, that's not going to happen." But But anyway, what they had to do to modify the 25s, first of all, they took out the lower gun turret and made that available for additional fuel. They took out the rear, the tail gun, and that saved some weight. They also eliminated in small ways and large. They modified these, but they took out the Norden bomb sight. They didn't want that to be captured. And one of the pilots invented something that he called the Mark Twain gun bomb sight. It cost all of 30 cents to make, something like that, and it was simply almost like a rifle sight. Okay, they added. Some of the pilots begin to say, if we need to defend ourselves from the back end, we're going to have a heck of a time since you've taken out the tail gun and the lower turret. And so to make them happy, one of the pilots said, I've got an idea. And he put a bunch of wooden drumsticks, sawed the handles off, painted them black, and had them mounted in the back to look like 50 caliber machine guns. As far as I know, they didn't shoot down any Japanese planes with those, but they looked good. And they did think that it would probably prevent Japanese pilots from making rear attacks on them. Okay.
So really, the defensive systems of the planes were pretty minimal.
That's a good way of saying that. Yes.
Okay.
I wouldn't say that they were exactly like the B-29 later on, with all of the control turrets and central fire controls and so on. They were pretty minimal.
Yes. So who's Lieutenant Henry L. Miller?
Well, Henry Miller is the guy that taught them how to actually take off from a carrier. Okay. They started, first of all, we have to remember that the 17th Bomb Group was selected for this, and they were the only bomb group in the country that was equipped with B-25s. So they were the obvious choice to go on this mission. And they were sent, but they were never told what it was. They just said a very dangerous mission that's very, very important to the Allied cause. And so, as Laura would have it, everybody volunteered, and they all started out in Columbia, South Carolina. They left Pendleton, Oregon, went to Columbia, South Carolina, and from there they went down to Eglin Air Force Base or Air Base in Florida, not far from Pensacola. And there they had a number of auxiliary fields, and they were using those to do the practicing. And then they were trying, fairly short takeoffs and landings without really being told why, and certainly not the mission target. Henry Miller was a Navy flight instructor at nearby Pensacola, and one of the leaders of the 17th Bomb Group said maybe he just intuitively guessed that they might be taking off from a carrier and said maybe we need some instruction in this. So Hank Miller came over, met with the pilots first of all, and said, "Okay, I'm going to teach you how to take take a B-25 off from a carrier." And they were impressed, and they said, "Well, that sounds interesting. How much time do you have in a B-25?" And he said, "Well, the next one I see will be my first." He had never even seen one, so that didn't inspire a lot of confidence. But they went out to the airplane, and he said, "Now, please do exactly as I say." So he sat in the right seat. One of the pilots sat in the left, and he said, "Now do exactly what I say. Okay, I want you to stand on the brakes. Okay, get a flat prop. Full power, and pull the yoke right back into your chest, and do not let this airplane move. Okay, until I tell you to. Full flaps." Okay, now go. And they had been used to taking off at a speed between 120 and 130 and taking up a couple of thousand feet of runway. They were off in a few hundred feet, and the airspeed indicator said 50. And they kind of hung in the air, and then they insisted. The pilots, the Army Air Force pilots said, obviously the airspeed indicator is wrong. It's way off. So they checked it. Turned out to be right. And he said, "I'm telling you, this is what you'll have to do, and you can all do it." And sure enough, within a week, everybody had qualified for under 600 feet for takeoffs using that particular method. And of course, then soon it turned into a contest. You know how pilots are. Yeah, who can take off the shortest? And a guy named a lieutenant named Donald Smith actually won that pot. He took off in 287 feet.
Whoa.
And they never would have thought that possible. And the strongest headwind they had at the time was about 12 knots. And so he is largely responsible in lots of ways for teaching them how to get those bombers off of any carrier and still be alive.
And yeah, and so I mean, you know, joint operations
Absolutely.
between the Army and Navy were not normal. In
This would be one of the first.
Yeah, exactly. And so, you know, in addition to teaching them about aircraft carrier operations, obviously, and taking off with a much shorter distance, did naval personnel assist them in any other ways? I mean, we certainly when they got on the ship, they were like fish out of water, literally. Okay.
Yes, they absolutely were. If you'll indulge me for just a second, I'd like to read real briefly a passage from my book, Dick Cole's War, that directly hits on what you're talking about. It was April Fool's Day of 1942, and Second Lieutenant Dick Cole was feeling every bit the fool. There was absolutely nothing intuitive, nothing remotely commonsensical about a U.S. Navy ship. He wanted to say boat, but Hank Miller had cautioned against that. It was a ship or a vessel. Boats were much smaller. And hallways were passageways, stairs were companionways or ladders, right was starboard, left was port, the floor was a deck. Thank God he'd soon be off of this vessel. As if a whole new lexicon was not enough, the Hornet itself was a maze, a rabbit warren as large as a city stacked vertically, street over street, road over alley, track over sidewalk, cabins over more cabins over, well, who knew what? How were Army pilots ever supposed to find the dining hall, now renamed the mess deck, or the bathrooms, transmogrified into heads? Rooms were spaces, walls were bulkheads. It was enough to make all the men of the Doolittle party want to grab some air on the main deck and rethink this whole deal.
So they really had to be taught a new way of life in a military context.
Absolutely. I mean, the whole idea, of getting bored and having to salute, and to be shown where they were going to be quartered for the next couple of weeks. Yeah,
right.
It was a major, as you said, whatever the opposite is of a fish out of water, that's what they were feeling like.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Right. So,
and I have to say this too,
yeah.
John, the Navy guys aboard, remember, nobody, including the Raiders, knew where they were going. Pete Mitcher, the Hornets captain, and of course Doolittle knew. And some of the guys, there'd been a lot of talk about it, but nobody really knew. And nobody except the captain of the Hornet knew anything about where they were going. They had been told they were going to take these bombers to Hawaii, but they knew that strapped down the way they were defenseless. All of their planes were below, in the hangar deck. And so the Navy guys were just sort of interlopers. They were not appreciated at all. And they let the Army guys know that they were just not, they weren't particularly welcome. Okay.
So right. So you actually touched on this, but we should go into more specific detail. The launch of the aircraft from the Hornet did not go as planned. So why was that?
Well, let me just follow up with one thing and tell you that on the second day out, sailing out of Alameda and under the Golden Gate Bridge, when they were 2 days out, and the Army was feeling pretty bad, and the Navy hated the Army, Pete Mitcher got on the tannoy and said, "Now hear this: this force is bound for Tokyo." And the ship absolutely went crazy, and suddenly these uninvited guests, the Army, became the most popular guys on the ship. Everybody wanted to come up and talk to them. They wanted to show them, around the ship. The pilots wanted to show them their birds, below decks, and and they were suddenly treated very, very differently than they had when they first got on. Okay.
Interesting.
So,
Yeah. So let's go back to the launch itself, because you talked about the distances and what they had planned, but
sure.
circumstances intervened.
Yeah, and let's look at this map, and you can see that the Enterprise and the Hornet, the Hornet did hook up with the Enterprise with Bull Halsey aboard on about the 13th of April, and they became Task Force 16. And their idea was to get within about 400 miles. However, the Japanese had set out a series of picket boats at an arc of about 650 miles from the islands, the Japanese islands, and they ran into those early on the morning of April the 18th. The idea was they were going to launch sometime mid-afternoon on the 19th. And Doolittle and his crew were going to be the first off. They were going to fly, drop incendiary bombs on some places in Tokyo that would light it up. And the others would take off and arrive after dark, guided by the fires. Okay. But they had been spotted by the picket boats. They did not have radar. The Japanese did not. But the American vessels had radar, and they picked them up at a range of 20,000 yards, and said, "We've got some problems here." And sure enough, they had been spotted. And one of the radio men said, "They have just sent a radio signal." The fishing boat, that's the Situ Maru, and so they knew they had been spotted. So then at 8 o'clock in the morning, as many of the Army pilots were on their way to the mess deck to get breakfast, instead they said, "Army pilots, man your planes. Army pilots, man your planes." So they immediately turned around, grabbed their loaded B-4 bags and headed for the aircraft, had them pre-flighted and ready to go within minutes. And by 8:20. They had launched the first aircraft, and that was, of course, Doolittle and crew. And by the way, he was the first one. The others were all kind of stacked up behind him, so they had the very shortest deck. In fact, he asked one of the handlers there on the Hornet, "So how much exactly from my nose wheel to the end of this deck?" He said, 467 feet. Okay, we can do that. And so they were the first ones off. And as you heard in the voiceover, at the beginning of this, they flew between 250 and 300 feet all the way into. They also knew at the time that they probably were not going to have enough fuel to make the landing fields that they had hoped to make in China. And they also had picked up a headwind, which really threw them way back and way behind the power curve of gasoline consumption. And so it did create a problem. Yeah, but the reason, again, for the early launch was because they had been spotted.
So how many of the B-25 bombers were able to make it to Japan? What happened?
Okay, there were 16. Okay, and they all made landfall at Japan. Okay, one, however, was already using far too much fuel. There was something wrong with his carburetors or the settings or something, and so he ended up saying, "We've got to get out of here because we are never going to get out of here with the fuel that we have." He ended up turning right and landing in a small piece of Russia that wasn't very far away from Japan, and so. The others all hit targets that had been predetermined in 5 Japanese cities. And the plan then was to turn south rather than go straight west. They turned south before they turned back west, simply so they hoped that nobody would see exactly where they were going and couldn't trace them that way. And one of the things, the fuel that they had aboard, they also had a whole, plane full of 5-gallon fuel cans that they kept emptying into the fuel supply. They used that first before they got into the bladders of the fuel. system of the airplane. And one of the things that they were told to do was to tie them all together and do not throw them out and create a trail back, to the task force. Okay, hold on to them and then throw them out all at once. Okay, when you got closer to Japan. So they did. They bombed their targets. None of them were shot down. They headed for China, and they really didn't think that was going to come to fruition. At one point, looking down below them, they thought they were still operating on the assumption that they had a headwind, and they were making preparations to ditch their bomber. That is, Cole and Doolittle's bomber, and they spotted a Japanese vessel below them, and Doolittle said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do. If we have to ditch, we're going to pick out a boat, a ship, a vessel, and we're going to land as close to it as we can in the water. And then we've all got a 45. We're going to board that vessel and take it over." Well, it was a plan. I guess it made them feel better. But even Cole laughed about that later when he was telling me about it. And he said, 5 guys with 45s were going to take over a warship. He said, "Well, it made us feel better knowing we had something to do anyway."
Hey, they're Army guys.
Yeah, exactly.
Anything's possible. So we need to get into the strategic importance of this raid, because it really was important. It changed how the Japanese viewed the United States at that time. Maybe you could elaborate on that.
Sure. The strategic, the actual damage done by 15 bombers with dropping 2,000 pounds of bombs on Japan didn't create a lot of damage, and so tactically it was more of a in your face kind of a thumb your nose, like it sent a message to the Japanese warriors and war leaders that said, "We're coming for you. You're not safe." Okay, that really messed with their minds in lots of ways. And so in the end, what they ended up doing was, we can't do this again. They were expecting that. We'll talk about this maybe in another minute or two. But they knew the raiders were coming. They just didn't expect them then. They expected them to be at least another day. They thought that the Hornet and the task force would have to sail within about 200 miles. They didn't know they had Army bombers. They were thinking, Navy torpedo bombers or something aboard, and about a 400, 500-mile round trip would have been about it. So that they took their time. They had plenty of time. They knew nothing was going to happen for the next number of hours. But after the raid, they realized, I think maybe we miscalculated. We need a much bigger arc of defensive positions around the home islands, and so that's what they did. That eventually ended up because the Americans had cracked the Japanese code, and they were able to read their messages. They knew that they were planning some action down around Midway, so they sent 3 of their carriers to Midway. And the Japanese sent 4 of their carriers, along with all the accompanying vessels, warships that are comprised of task force. And at the end of the day, the Japanese lost all 4 of their carriers, and hundreds of pilots Japanese pilots, the cream of their crop actually, who had no place to go, and they splashed down in the middle of the ocean. They lost a huge number of first line pilots. And that,
right. I mean, the planes actually they could replace, but they couldn't replace the people.
Yeah, you can make more airplanes pretty quickly, but to train a really good pilot and give him the experience that those pilots all had. After all, many of them, they were the same 4 of the 6 carriers that attacked at Pearl Harbor. These guys were hardened. They knew how to fly combat, and now they were gone. So it really tended to sort of put an end to that sort of rushing unabated to the quarterback that the Japanese have been doing all through the Pacific, and sort of Southeast Asia. And that was the beginning of the end, even though that nobody would say that at the time. It was the beginning of the end for the Japanese.
Right. So they superimposed their tactical view from Pearl Harbor on the distances involved for a carrier attack on what they thought the U.S. Navy could do. And then when they were disabused of that, violently disabused, although not with, massive damage, but because of the raid, they had to really change their strategy because suddenly the distances were not quite as they had imagined.
That's exactly true. Plus, the Japanese were counting on the Americans doing something similar. They had already, American carriers had already attacked, the Marshalls and the Gilberts. They had attacked at Wake Island. They had attacked, Marcus Island, and they got within less than 200 miles before they released their planes to attack those islands. And they thought, surely that's what's going to happen here too. They really miscalculated the idea of much longer range Army bombers.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. So we're coming up on when we want to focus on questions from our audience, but I would like you to share with us the tradition of the silver goblets. Yes.
I'll have to back up just a little bit and tell you why the silver goblets, came to be. Doolittle had told all the raiders that, if any of them survived any of this, that he was going to give them the biggest party they had ever seen at war's end. Okay, so in 1946, a year after, they rented a number of rooms at a hotel, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the city in Florida, but the raiders showed up to that. And apparently it was a real smashing success of a party, quite literally, to the point that the manager wrote Doolittle a letter and said, well, I guess you guys had a lot of fun because you sure wrecked the hotel. And I didn't get a single night's, a single wink of sleep. So please don't come back. So they began rotating where they met at cities around the country, and the cities. You have to remember that these were probably the biggest group of heroes of World War II. I mean, they were idolized everywhere they went. And cities began vying and, say, what about this? We'll give you this or this, to hold their parties at the various cities. And by 1959, I think they had begun to include the wives. Okay, so the parties had kind of calmed down a little bit. And the city of Tucson, Arizona, sort of said, would really like to, and we've got a little present for you. And they had made sterling silver goblets about 3 or 4 inches high, engraved twice with the name of every one of the 80 Doolittle Raider names. One, so you read it this way, and then if you flipped it over this way, the name, could still be read. And every year at their reunions, they toasted those who had gone west, as they say, in aviation. And the tradition was that Hennessy had also gave Doolittle a bottle of VSOP cognac from the year 1896, which was Doolittle's birth year. Okay, and the idea was that the last 2 Doolittle Raiders still alive were going to crack that open and drink a toast to everybody else, and then that'd be the end of the meetings. Well, they waited until there were about 4 of them left and said, this is silly. Let's just go ahead and open this bottle now. And they did that publicly. They were going to meet, I have to tell you this, they were going to meet very, very privately and get this done. And the Air Force said, no, you're not. We're going to do this. We're going to have the biggest event.
Right. It's too big of a PR opportunity to
absolutely. They were not going to pass that up. And so they ballyhooed it, and they had a really large gathering for the final toast at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. And it was well attended. And they all, the four of them who were still remaining, only three of them made because one of them, who had been a prisoner of war of the Japanese for 4 years, he couldn't make it. He was too ill. That was Bobby Height. But the three of them drank a toast to everybody. And when someone asked Dick later about how was it, he said, "Well, it was okay, but they were pretty stingy when they poured it." And I will have to say this as an addendum to that. When he turned 100, I invited him up to the Kansas City area, and the Commandant of Air Force was going to do a big party for him up here, and they said, "What kind of booze should we get?" And I said, "Well, you've got to get VSOP cognac. What are you thinking about?" So they bought 2 bottles of that, and then a whole lot of other bottles of something lesser, and I don't even know what it was. But at the big hangar event that night, with several hundred people there, they went around and they had little shot glasses made with 100th anniversary or 100th birthday, happy birthday, Dick Cole, and gave them to everybody. And then they went around and poured everybody, that much cognac. And at the appropriate time, everyone raised their glass, they downed it. In a little while, someone from the CAF came around. Dick and I were sitting at a table up near front, and he said, "Colonel Cole, would you like some more?" He looked up at him and said, "Yes, I would. Leave the bottle." He just took the bottle and set it down. It was really good.
It's like a John Wayne movie. So there are some military service legends regarding the raid that should be debunked. So how about a couple of those?
Okay. One of them, we gave a program on the 75th anniversary of Pearl Harbor a few years ago in Kansas City at the World War I Museum. And at the end of the program, we took some questions, and then he said, "I just want to settle the dust on one issue." And he said that was, this idea that everybody in the 17th Bombardment Group stepped forward, and we were all heroes. We all wanted to bomb Japan. Please pick us. And he said, we were the only B-25 group in the country. We were going whether we volunteered or not.
If you're the only ones that can do it, you're volunteering. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. He said it's more like we were voluntold.
There you go. Right.
And so that's one thing I think that people probably want to know something about. Another one is that repeatedly, while they were on, both before they boarded the Hornet and while they were still on the Hornet before the raid, Doolittle repeatedly said, "Now, if any man wants to withdraw from this, you can do so without any thought that anything will ever be on your record. No, nothing will ever be said if you do that." Okay, and by the way, they had extra crews. They had a lot of extra people who were wanting to go on that mission. Some of them not so much. And they took photos, and you showed one a little while ago of the Doolittle crew. They took similar photos for all of those 16 bombers with 5-man crews. And there is one crew in which there was a switch, because one man and simply said, "Colonel, I don't think I can do this." And so they had plenty of people, and they put someone else in. And there is one of those photographs. For the sharp-eyed among you might be able to tell has been photoshopped, and there's a face on somebody else's body. Okay, I never asked Dick because I knew he would never say anything. I think it's indicative of who those men were. They said they wouldn't ever make anything about anybody who wanted to back out, and they didn't. To this day, no one has ever named that man, and for that reason, I never made any effort to try to find out who it was. But I know that there was one who said, "Can't do it." And that photo is there as again for the sharp-eyed. And I won't even tell you which crew. I'm not going to do that.
Yeah. Well, so now, what the total personnel involved, air crews?
Okay, there were 16 air crews with 5 men each, so there were 80 men altogether.
Okay.
And when they got to China, they all ran out of fuel. In Dick's case, they hit a really bad storm. It was late at night. It was about 9 at night. It was black, raining. They were being tossed around like a toy, and they were beginning to sputter. They were running out of fuel, and Doolittle said, "I guess we're going to have to get out of here." And that Dick said the only time that I was ever the least bit scared on that mission is when we opened that hatch, in the belly of the plane, and I looked down and this is a black hole, and I thought, "What am I doing here?" And someone asked him one time at a program, "What was your most exciting moment of that entire raid?" And he said, "When my parachute opened."
Right. Yeah, that's a exciting and positive
Absolutely.
moment. Right. Right. I mean, well, they had no frame of reference with this part of the world.
No, they did
in which
not.
they were flying.
And they came down all over. Two of the crews ended up crashing close to, the beaches and close to the. Is that Doolittle's plane? I think his was more of a wreck than that. But two of the crews landed on beaches at the the Chinese beaches, and they were captured. Two of the men drowned. One man died from another crew bailing out. He probably hit the tail of the aircraft. So 3 men died, just getting out of or trying to get out of the planes. 8 men were captured. They were tried. Three were executed. 1 died as a prisoner of war. 4 survived throughout the end of the war.
Wow.
And when they were rescued, they weighed about 90 pounds each.
Right. Yeah. It wasn't a good experience to be a prisoner of war of the Empire of Japan during World War II.
Prisoners of war of the Germans, air crews, suffered a fatality rate of about 5% during the war. It was about 50% if you remember, if you were a POW of the Japanese.
You didn't want to be captured by the Japanese. Well, of course, their mentality is that you were a lesser human because you didn't die. You didn't kill yourself. You weren't killed in battle. You're just not.
That warrior ethos, right?
That's it. Yeah, that's it. It was truly a cultural thing. So turning to some of the questions we have in the chat, we've got one here about when the member of Admiral King's staff was visiting Norfolk and watching B-25s landing or taking off or whatever they were doing.
That was Captain Lowe.
Yeah, so Captain Lowe. So why were the B-25s there in Norfolk?
Okay, those B-25s, they were not B-25s that were doing that. They were Navy fighters that were taking off and landing.
So he was looking at a Navy training exercise, and he's thinking, hey, what if I could put
but he did see some Army bombers that were not B-25s, making like runs at the same area on his flight back.
I got you.
I do have to say this, though, that there were some B-25s that were sent. When they begin to think the B-25 is the only one that's going to be able to do this, they asked Hap Arnold to send them 3 B-25s that they then loaded onto the Hornet that was still in Norfolk. And one of them was not able to be a part of that because they were having engine problems. But two B-25s, lightly loaded and with no crew, actually went out into the Atlantic and took off from the Hornet to prove that it could be done. And that was in February 2nd, I think, of 1942.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So that's really interesting. I mean, people were really thinking outside the box after Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, and it's too bad they weren't thinking outside the box before Pearl Harbor, but that's another story.
Yeah, indeed. So we have another question about submarines supporting the raid, and a question about what their role was.
Okay, the role was if it looked like warships were going to be coming in and to intercept the task force, they were going to try to take them out. At the very least, they were going to take pictures and let them know you need to be turning left 09 or something, whatever. You need to get out of here because bad things are going to happen.
But so the submarines must have been pre-positioned because the task force is operating at what, 20 plus knots?
20 plus knots, and I think they were kind of like scouts out ahead of them. They were making sure that it was clear ahead of them. The Thresher was one of those. John, you just disappeared. Oh, there you are.
Oh, I'm trying to fix. I'm blurry, so sometimes if I click off and click on, it helps. But
okay. So that was the role of the submarines. They were kind of guards for them, to let them know.
okay.
And then, by the way, the American ships did have radar. The Japanese did not have radar at this time, and so we had kind of a leg up in that way.
So another question about anti-aircraft batteries encountered in the raid. One would assume that Tokyo, for example, was protected by some.
One would have thought, but again, sort of a fortuitous thing happened. They were having an exercise with a new twin-engine Japanese bomber on the same day, strictly by serendipity. And the word had gone out that there's a new bomber with twin engines. Don't be shooting at bombers, right? Right. And in fact, at an air show in Oshkosh, Dick and I were up there one time, and he'd given a little talk about the raid, and a Japanese man in the audience, somewhat elderly, raised his hand and said, "I was a student at the time of the raid, and I was hiking in the mountains, and I looked down and I saw two camouflage twin engine airplanes fly below me through a valley, and I waved and I was so happy." He said, "It was later that I found out it was you guys." I said, "I want to take my wave back."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that you're waving at the bad guys, at least from his
their perspective. Yeah.
His perspective. So we're at the end of our time, and I want to thank you very much, Denny, Professor Okerstrom. This was wonderful, just a truly delightful discussion. Although you did all the talking, or most of the talking, and so I want to extend the appreciation of the Commandery and of the Naval Order of the United States for your taking the time to do this with us.
It's what happens when you give a professor a mic.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind for the future. Speaking of the future, I've got a teaser for next month's lecture, which will be more of a presentation. And all I want to say about it is, and by the way, it's on June 23rd, same Naval Order time as this evening. And for those of you who think you know a lot about the history of carrier aviation in World War II, or operations of carriers in naval aviation in World War II, all I'll say is it involves two aircraft carriers that have as propulsion systems side wheel paddles. These were fully commissioned U.S. warships in World War II that were basically paddle wheel steamers. So that will be our topic for next month. And with that, I bid you all a wonderful evening wherever you are in the world.
And if any of you listen, thanks so much. I had fun. Thanks.